Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful Purim, and if you're a Toshav Yerushalayim, a wonderful Purim Shulash. And just in case you didn't have enough sugar on Purim itself, the OU, we are generously accommodating you outside there. Um, I just want to have a very few concluding comments about the Mishnah Torah. Then I want to move to the Moreh Nevuchim, and then we will eventually get to the letters, although probably not this week. First, we looked at the table of contents of the Rambam, and I don't know, maybe I'm obsessed with table of contents, but I enjoy looking at the genius of the organization and the plan and the notion of the totality of halacha being organized in such a beautiful, wonderful way, as well as the amazing source material that the Rambam had to master, the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, all the halachic midrashim, the Tosefta, and the Rambam had to ascertain what is the final ruling that emerges from all of the discussions. Anyone that's ever learned a page of Gemara understands that to kind of ascertain what the halacha is from a question and answer dialectical process is very, very, very difficult. And took the Rambam 10 years. And the Rambam was, as I said, frankly, very proud of his work. He referred to it, he refers to it often in his letters, and he had hoped it would become the definitive final code of Jewish law. As we pointed out the last time we talked 2 weeks ago about this, that did not come to pass per se. In many ways, the Mishnah Torah became what the Rambam hoped it wouldn't become, a springboard for further analysis, argument, discussion, as opposed to being the final word. The Rambam wanted to kind of seal the discussion and give you final psak. Instead, it became the springboard for discussion that goes on to this very day. I do need to mention that the Rambam actually was critiqued, you might call it fact checked in modern parlance, halacha by a younger contemporary who was a great, great, great scholar, Rav Avram ben David, called the Ravid, who lived in France. And he went over the Mishnah Torah with a fine tooth comb. And you will notice that if you open up a Rambam, every few paragraphs, there'll be something called Omar Avraham. The Ravid says, and he'll either say, once in a while, he'll say, good gesagt, Yafa Omar, once in a while, not too often. Other times he might say something like Shtus vehevel, or he might say Kama niyorot hifsid, how much paper was wasted on this. Uh, Now, these are called the Hasagos Haravid, the critiques of the Ravid. Now, the truth of the matter is, in a way, it's a disservice to the Ravid, because the first thing anybody thinks of when they hear the Ravid is, oh, the Ravid is the guy that goes around criticizing everybody. The truth is, the Ravid was a phenomenally great Rishon who wrote many, many, many commentaries of his own in which he elaborates. In the Rambam, it's very staccato, just short, like 2-line things, but still, it is a staple of advanced yeshiva learning to this day that you want to analyze what is the machlokes, the Rambam and the Ravid, and what is it based on. In fact, the Ravid was so critical. I don't mean that negatively, but he read the Rambam so carefully that already in the Rambam's introduction, the Ravid has different points that he disagrees with and the like. So one should be aware of the Ravid. I've also mentioned that although most of the controversies about the Rambam's works concern the Moreh Nevuchim, which we'll get to, there were controversies concerning the Mishnah Torah itself, and the controversies fall into what you might call 3 categories. Category 1 is mamash analogous to the Moreh Nevuchim controversy, and that is the first 4 chapters of the Mishnah Torah. In the section that's called Yesodei Torah, the fundamental principles of the Torah, is essentially an exposition of the Aristotelian concept of the universe, that somehow the Rambam found an excuse to stick it in a halachic work. And that's why you'll notice that although throughout the Mishnah Torah, the commentaries of the Rambam always give a Talmudic source or something, the first 4 chapters of Yesodei Torah There are no sources that are given because, frankly, the only source is Aristotle. So, therefore, the same types of critiques that we are going to see about the Guide to the Perplexed were on those 4 chapters. So, for example, there were communities that issued a ban, not allowed to study Moreh Nevuchim and the first 4 chapters of Mishna Torah, which essentially were an Aristotelian distillation of the universe. That was critique number 1. Critique number 2 was the Rambam's failure to cite sources. The Rambam just tells you what the halacha is. He doesn't tell you where he got it from. He doesn't explain his chain of reasoning. And the issue was, as the Ravid himself comments, he says, if he would give me the sources, I could evaluate whether his arguments are good or not good. This way, he's like playing God. He's simply standing on the mountain and giving me rules. And who says that I should follow those rules? Unless he tells me sources, makorot. Now, in truth, in one of the letters of the Rambam confesses that he wished he would have made a companion. He didn't want to clutter up the Mishnah Torah with sources because that would defeat the purpose. The whole purpose was to give a practical guide and not necessarily give you voluminous sources. So he didn't regret not putting sources in the Mishnah Torah, but he regretted, he said, not having a companion volume. Because you'd have the Mishnah Torah, and then you'd have a companion volume that would give a lot of sources. He didn't have time to actually do that. And strangely enough, there were times where he himself could not remember because he would often be asked in the Tshuvot Rambam, he would often be asked, you say this in the Mishnah Torah, where do you get it from? You say something in Hilchot Shabbat, and I learned all of Masechet Shabbat, and it's not there. Where did you get it from? And there are most of the time the Rambam said, "Oh, I got it from here, some obscure place." Maseches Zevachim, addresses it. Most of the time he was able to reconstruct it, but there were times, frankly, that he was lost. He forgot. I have to say, been there, done that. It often is the case. Although with the Rambam, it's always a surprise that even the Rambam was prone to it. Maybe that's a bit of a comfort for us lesser mortals. But there were times where, frankly, the Rambam could not remember, meaning it's one thing if a law of Shabbos is in Masechah Shabbos, okay, so that he'll know. But if a law of Shabbos is the Tosefta of Maseches Uktzin, that's kind of mentioned as an aside, it's going to be hard to always remember those things. And even the Rambam was overwhelmed sometimes, and it's amazing how infrequently that happens. Very, very rarely, but there were such times. And as a result, he said, I should have annotated. I should have made a note where everything was from, and we would have it as a separate volume. So that was a separate accusation that the Rambam didn't give source material. The third accusation, which is kind of related, is that it almost seems as if the Rambam wanted to displace the study of Gemara. In other words, the Rambam's claim that the reason he called his book Mishna Torah, the second Torah, is because he said, all you need is Chumash and my book, and that's everything. I'm the oral Torah. Well, so you're basically saying, forget about Gemara. Why do I have to do questions, answers, dialecticals? So the Ravid actually accused the Rambam of wanting to just get rid of studying Talmud. And the Rambam actually wrote a letter in which, Chas v'sholom, I didn't mean that, etc. Although I actually suspect he did mean that in many, many ways. But okay, so those are the 3 main accusations. One is the philosophical material. The other is lack of sources. The third was the attempt, or at least the accusation, that he wanted to replace study of Talmud. And there was a fourth issue, which is more specific, and that is, who gave him the samchut, the authority, to choose among conflicting views. Let's imagine that in the Gemara, we have 5 opinions. And the Rambam paskins like opinion number 3. Well, who says opinion number 3 is the halacha? Maybe it's 1, 2, 4, and 5. So that's a separate issue, which is really more of a halachic debate issue, meaning what is the basis? Now, I do want to point out that remember that between the end of the Gemara and the Rambam is almost 1,000 years of a period that we know as the Gaonim in Bavel. And the Gaonim were centered in Bavel, but they were the world leaders, so to speak, of Jewry. And She'elot were sent to them from the whole diaspora. As you just showed me, you had to pay, though, because that's how it was funded. The Gaonim was funded by money that people would pay to get shuvot to their communities and the like. In truth, interestingly enough, the Rambam did not have a tremendous respect for the Gaonim, meaning although we have this idea that the generations go down and therefore we don't argue with the Talmud, and the Rambam is absolutely clear we don't argue with the Talmud, but he felt that anything after the Talmud has no particular binding authority. So when the Rambam liked what the Gaonim said, he followed them. When he didn't like what the Gaonim said, it didn't really bother him to argue with the Gaonim. He did not regard the Gaonim as that authoritative. I mean, they were Talmidei Chachamim like all Talmidei Chachamim. And as a result, in the Hakdama to the Mishnah Torah, he very much emphasizes the centrality of the Talmud as the basis of all halacha. So that's a little bit about the controversies of the Mishnah Torah. Again, I want to go on to a new thing, but just to finish up that topic. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're correct. You're correct. But again, it goes back to sources. But you have to justify it. Meaning you can't just flip a coin. Meaning that's again, it goes back to the source issue. Meaning, the Rambam made a choice, granted, but given the fact that he didn't give you sources, he didn't give you the basis for his choice. Now, sometimes the choice is simple, because the Talmud itself lays down a number of rules regarding choice. I mean, one example is, of course, Yachid v'Rabim halacha k'Rabim. So if you have a majority of the sages versus an individual person, the halacha is like the majority of the sages. Other rules are halacha k'Rabbi Akiva mechaveiro. When Rabbi Akiva argues with anybody, we follow Rabbi Akiva. Other times, there are many Hillel and Shammai. So there are around 20 or 25 rules. So when you have a Talmudic rule for choosing, and the Rambam was simply following the Talmudic rule, that's fairly simple. In other words, the Rambam picked opinion 3 because it's Rabbi Akiva's opinion, or the Rambam picked opinion 3 because it's the Chachamim's opinion. Those are simple cases, and they tend to be non-controversial cases. But there are other times where a particular Talmudic rule is not going to tell you which of those 5 opinions are right. And the Rambam picked number 3. And usually in Shuvot, he addresses this. People would ask him questions. Why did you pick opinion number 3? And he would explain it through a chain of reasoning, which in the Mishnah Torah is absent. The chain of reasoning is not explicated. So again, that's I wouldn't call that an overall critique, but those were specific machloksim that would come up at various points. Yeah.
From what I understand, the Mishnah Torah is kind of like monarch notes on the Gemara. If you don't want to go through all the critiques and the criticism, you want to know the bottom line.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people try to teach Gemara and people are said, well, what should we do? And there's no answer. Because everybody offers opinions.
That's correct.
So his work is valuable. And if people don't want to know the bottom line so quickly and they want to study everything, they have the option of studying everything.
Yeah, well, that's So you're a good defender of the Rambam. Essentially, you are restating what the Rambam said. The Rambam says, "I'm not taking away Gemara from anybody, but there are people who are not able to follow the complexities of these arguments. They get confused." Well, he didn't want to say, "I'm writing it for people who don't want to learn Gemara." That would have been a little too close to the heretical line. But he said, "Yeah, I know." But that would have See, if he would have said it that way, that would have fed a little bit into the Breitowitz critique that you're telling people not to bother with Gemara. Instead, the Rambam's argument was many people can't follow things, and many people, even if they follow the discussion, they don't really know what the bottom line is. So therefore, I'm doing a service to Klal Yisrael. That was the Rambam's definition, and the Rambam even apologized, saying, I have students and I learn Gemara with them. I don't just learn my book with them. I myself, learn Gemara. He had to protest and say, I do Gemara too, and the like. So that's one point. Now, a second point about, again, I have a few miscellaneous observations, is the Rambam created this magnificent organizational table of the totality of halacha in these 14 books with all of the subdivisions. But there were a few sore thumbs. There were a few halachas that the Rambam actually couldn't figure out where to put it. And he stuck it in some very odd places. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of things that don't really fit where they are, but the Rambam had no other place to put it. The very last book, the 14th book, if you'll recall, or if you have your table of contents, is called the Book of Shoftim, the book of, like the Book of Nach, but the book of the judicial system. You have the laws of the Sanhedrin, the laws of punishments, the laws of the laws of kings and their wars. That's also considered to be a form of the justice system, meaning essentially the criminal code of Judaism and the judicial structure. Now, there are 2 things in the book of Judges that seemingly don't belong there. One is Hilchos Avel, the laws of mourning, and the other are the laws of honoring father and mother. Now, why would they be put there? And the technical reason that's given is, well, after the Rambam discusses all the laws of execution and death penalties, well, since people are dead, I might as well discuss the laws of mourning. So Hilchos Avel just got stuck in because there was no other particularly logical place to put it. So he put it in conjunction with people who get killed by the Sanhedrin. The funny thing about that is that that's exactly a case where the laws of mourning are not observed. it's a very odd situation. If someone is killed by the Sanhedrin, the families do not sit shiva for such. I mean, it's a rare situation. Sanhedrin that kills every 7 years or every 70 years was called the bloody Sanhedrin. But when that happens, the family does not observe mourning. So to say the Rambam put in mourning, incidental to the people getting killed by the Sanhedrin is actually a logical non sequitur, but that's where he put it in. What about Kibbud Aviyim? Well, here is the train of association that kind of becomes necessary. Since the Rambam discusses the court system, he has a whole section devoted to those who refuse to accept the authority of the Sanhedrin. This is the parsha in the Torah that is called Zakein Mamre, the elder who refuses to accept authority. Now that's talking about authority of the Sanhedrin. So the Rambam says, well, okay, refusal to accept authority of your superior, that could also apply to children and their relationship to their parents. Therefore, in Hilchos Mamrim, the laws of rebellion, the Rambam puts in the laws of Kibbud Aviyim. Again, it's not thematically really connected, but there was no better place to put it. Finally, in a book which is devoted to halacha, one might think it's a little odd that we have 2 chapters, the last 2 chapters of the Mishna Torah, devoted to Mashiach. Very, very fascinating. In the Shulchan Aruch, there's nothing called Hilchos Mashiach. It's not there at all. But the Rambam actually ended the Mishnah Torah about describing Mashiach. And where do you stick it? In the laws of kings, because Mashiach will be from Malchus Beis David. So in the laws of kings and war, the last 2 chapters are devoted to Melech HaMashiach. And I should also mention that that's where the Rambam sticks the 7 laws of Noach, the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach that non-Jews are obligated to keep, is in the middle of the laws of kings. It's not particularly clear why it belongs there. The point basically is the Rambam had a very, very human problem. The Rambam had a huge, tremendous, massive material that he had to organize. And the organization was totally original. He did not follow the Mishnah or the Talmud. He followed his own unique organization. And he managed to do us, to get this 99.9% right. But there are some things that just didn't fit, and he had to stick it in various places. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the Talmud, it's in Maseches Kedushin. But again, you can't ask kashas on the Talmud because the Talmud is totally disorganized. That's for sure. The Talmud goes with free association in every topic. So one cannot ask on the Talmud, oh, why is it here and not here? I mean, the nature of Gemara is it goes on. But since the Rambam was very, very meticulous in orderly, systematic presentation and organization. So on the Rambam, there is always going to be a question. Why is something here? On the Gemara itself, it's not so much of a question. Yeah.
All the examples you gave seem to be that the Rambam is following the Sanhedrin. All those topics you mentioned are all including Sanhedrin, which deals with Shoftim. And one thing that started with that. So in Mashiach, it's Perach.
Yeah.
You're talking about Kibbut Avim. You have Makkah. Ovid, Emo, once you talk about capital cases.
Yeah.
So one of them is making a kabula on your.
Okay, I hear you, and that makes sense, and I've heard that idea advanced, and that makes sense. But once again, you have to remember that was normally not the way the Rambam proceeded. In fact, the Rambam even writes in the Hakdama that he will not be following the order of the ways things are presented in the Gemara. He will be following more of a logical order, unlike his great predecessor, the Rif. And the Rif was the model for the Rambam's halachos, at least the halachos that apply today. But the Rif simply followed the order of the Gemara in presenting it. The Rambam said he was creating a new order. So it could be that when he was stuck, he reverted maybe to an original plan. Now, let me mention another aspect. I saw a very fascinating article. Many of you might have heard of Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik. He was Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. Okay, Baruch Hashem. Okay. Well, I tell you, in the yeshiva world, many have not. So maybe I have to, have greater respect for my OU audience. But Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik is, of course, the only son of Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik of Yeshiva University in Boston. And phenomenal, really, he's a great Talmud Chacham and a great historian, brilliant person. A few years ago, 3 volumes of his collected essays were issued, and they are amazing reading, just fascinating reading. In fact, he devotes a long article to the letter we'll be looking at, the Maimer Kiddush Hashem, about apostasy and giving up your life. And he actually wrote a long critique, a long discussion of that letter. And he also published many responses to people who disagreed with him. So I'm going to be using that when we finally get to that particular letter. But in one of his articles, he discusses various problems in the organization of the Rambam in the Mishna Torah. And one of them, and I'll just mention one point because this is a long article, 100 pages, but is Hilchos Shabbos. In the first parak of Hilchos Shabbos, the Rambam lays down the fundamental principles of what is a malacha. Definitionally, what is a forbidden act to do on Shabbos? And he talks about the elements of intention, because intention plays a very important point. And it's really a sodistic halacha. But then Dr. Soloveitchik points out that quite logically, one would have expected that after describing the general elements of malacha, he should then go on and discuss the 39 malachos. I mean, that would be it. You give your introduction, then you go on to malachos. Instead, the Rambam talks about things that are not malachos per se, but he talks about what you do Friday afternoon and leaving food on the oven or on the stovetop before Shabbos to cook on Shabbos. But he hasn't discussed the prohibition of cooking yet. He seems to be discussing rabbinic peripheral laws, which are based on the prohibition of cooking rabbinically, but he doesn't discuss the malacha of cooking till much later. So Rav Soloveitchik, actually it's a Rav also, but Dr. Soloveitchik makes the interesting point that the Rambam had a certain agenda here, and that was an anti-Karaite agenda. You have to know, there are Karaim even today, but they're very, very small in number, and they're not significant. And they have, they have a shul, and they have a few, whatever, 100 people, whatever it would be. But in the Rambam's time, the Karaites, particularly in Egypt, were a huge, huge community. And of course, the Karaites were threatening the whole authority of the oral law. And in their way, they were not like reform. In their way, they were very religious. They were very observant. They were very meticulous in what they were keeping. And they posed a real threat to the Torah Shebal Peh. So Rav Soloveitchik tries to show that in various places in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam was kind of attacking the Karaites without mentioning the Karaites. And as you know, one of the characteristics of the Karaim is that they believed that you could not have a fire on Shabbos, even if it was lit before Shabbos. And as a result, they only ate cold food on Shabbos, and they had to be in darkness. And that's why the Rishonim say, anyone who does not eat chamin, you don't eat cholent on Shabbos, we are choshesh that maybe you're a Karaite. So if you don't like cholent, rethink that because you might be accused of being a Karaite. And therefore the Rambam B'dafka very early introduced the idea of putting food on the stove before Shabbos in order to have warm food, even though in terms of the overall halacha, these are rabbinic laws. They're not the basic malachot, but they were kind of an anti-Karaite agenda. Similarly, he ends Hilchot Shabbos. The last halacha in Hilchot Shabbos is he talks about the importance of tashmish hamita on Shabbos, marital intimacy on Shabbos. Now, it's interesting that in many, many ways, this is really a talk that needs to be much broader. The Rambam was not a great fan of physicality. In fact, the Rambam writes that the physical sense of touch is the most inferior of all senses because it's the most animalistic and the like. So he was not a great fan, unlike Ramban, who extolled, physicality of the Shem Shemayim. The Rambam tended to be ascetic in many, many ways. So why does he all of a sudden want to glorify, Tashmish Hamita on Shabbat? Again, Rabbi Soloveitchik suggests this was, again, an anti-Karaite measure. They basically took the position of that you had to have abstinence on Shabbos. It's a holy day. Every Shabbat should be like Yom Kippur and the like. So this is an interesting agenda that can be carried through in many, many parts of the Mishnah Torah, in which the Rambam was very, very concerned with Karaite influence, which today is very, very insignificant, but in the Rambam's time was a very, very major force. Karaim and Mitzrayim in particular were very, very large. By the way, there's another, yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. How many about Karaites were there? About?
There were thousands. I can't give you an exact number, but it ran in.
Some place to find out.
Yeah. You could look up Karaites in Wikipedia. I'm sure you'll get numbers. Now, let me just mention another community that the Rambam had to fight. Interestingly enough, he had to fight Israeli Yordim. There were people from Eretz Yisrael, religious people, who, for whatever reason, went to Mitzrayim, and they wanted to keep their old customs. Now, the Talmud itself records that the original custom in Eretz Yisrael was to finish the Torah every 3 years, the triennial cycle. The minhag of Babylonia was 1 year, as we do. And it seems that even in Eretz Yisrael, they eventually went to the 1 year. But there were some holdout congregations that were still doing the 3-year cycle. And apparently they came to Mitzrayim, a group of them, and they established their own Beit Knesset where in Cairo, in the Rambam city, in Fustat, which was the old Jewish part of Cairo. they established their own minyan where they did the Torah 3-year cycle. Now, the Rambam considered this very, very dangerous because essentially it was a merida against the decisions of the Babylonian Talmud. And remember, the Rambam held that the Talmud was the highest level of halachic authority, and the Rambam fought very ferociously to close down that minyan and the like. So he was. Well, a 3-year cycle. No, no, that's correct. That's correct. There's a lot of uncertainty how the 3-year cycle worked, but yeah, Parshat Bereshit would be read over 3 weeks. And Noach over. So they divided the parshios very, very differently. In fact, if you want to know how the cycle might have worked, if you look, for example, at the Medrash Rabbah of Sefer Bereshis, look at Bereshis Rabbah, and you will see it's divided. I don't remember the exact number, but approximately 92 parshiot. And it's not clear where the divisions are. How do you get 92? But some want to say that this reflects the old Eretz Yisrael minhag that it took 92 weeks to finish Chumash Bereshis. A year and a half. They divided it that way. Other parshios they did in fewer weeks and the like. So the Rambam had attackers from the left and from the right. One other point about the Mishnah Torah, just to be sure I've mentioned before that the Rambam wrote the Sefer HaMitzvos in Arabic, and he wrote the Perush HaMishnayos in Arabic, and he wrote the Moreh Nevuchim in Arabic. The Mishnah Torah was written in Hebrew. I just want to make clear that when I say the Rambam wrote it in Arabic, you'll often see this described as Judeo-Arabic. But I want to explain what that means. Judeo-Arabic is not Ladino. Judeo-Arabic is the term that's used for pure Arabic that is written in Hebrew letters. So the Rambam's Arabic works are written in Hebrew letters, but it's not in a jargon Arabic. It's in a pure Arabic with Hebrew letters. People sometimes misunderstand and they think it was Ladino. No, it's in regular literary Arabic, but they used Hebrew letters. Well, it was very common. I don't know why. Well, he did it because it was common when Jews would correspond in Arabic, they used Hebrew letters. It's not clear to me why that was so. Maybe they didn't want to honor Arabic, which after all was, yeah. Well, I'm sure many of them knew. I'm sure many of them knew it. I'm sure the Rambam could read and write in regular Arabic letters, but whatever. Okay. Alrighty. So that's kind of what I just wanted to conclude about the Mishnah Torah. Now let's go to the third great work of the Rambam, and that is the Moreh Nevuchim, which Guide to the Confused, Guide to the Perplexed, is the name. The Rambam wrote this around between 1185 and 1190, so he's between 50 and 55. He began it shortly after he finished the Mishnah Torah, and it is interesting that the initial impetus for this work was one student that he had met all the way back when the Rambam was a young man in Fez in Morocco, before he even came to Mitzrayim. So he met a young man, a little bit younger than the Rambam, who became his disciple, Yosef ben Yehuda. And even though they separated and didn't see each other shortly thereafter, there was a lifelong bond between them. The Rambam considered this Talmud very precious, very intelligent, very discerning, a pure heart. And the Rambam essentially wrote the Moreh Nevuchim as a series of letters to this Talmud. Now, I want to correct a very common bibliographical error that is often made. There was somebody called Yosef ben Yehuda ibn Aknin. So it's the same same name, Yosef ben Ibn Aknin, So you'll often sometimes see in older books, that the Rambam wrote his Sefer for Yosef ibn Aknin. That is actually a mistake. Yosef ben Yehuda ibn Aknin, who the Rambam knew. Actually, the Rambam did know him, and the Rambam had a correspondence with him. But that is not Yosef ben Yehuda for whom the Rambam wrote the Moreh Nevuchim. So it's a mistake that older books make, but in more recent history, that is corrected. And indeed, to this day, if you open up a Moreh Nevuchim, you will actually see it begins with, it's not really an introduction, it's a letter to his Talmud saying that I'm writing this for you because I want to share with you insights regarding the true meaning of the Torah and the true understanding of the Torah. And he writes that even though we are separated by distance, by miles, we are joined in the heart. And I will be sending you these chapters as I finish them, and you will then come to a true understanding of how to serve God and how to understand the mystical parts of the Torah, right? So this is called, this is the Psicha, this is the opening of the Moreh Nevuchim, which essentially is his dedication. Now, the truth of the matter is, it is a mistake to say he only wrote it as a private letter and then somehow it got published. The Rambam did intend to circulate the Sefer, but the advanced copy, so to speak, meaning Yosef and Yehuda got it chapter by chapter by chapter. When the Rambam then finished the book, took 5 years, 1185 to 1190. It was then distributed to the world, initially in Arabic. This was 1190. It was translated into Hebrew 1204. Shortly before the Rambam's death, the translation was completed by the Rambam's official translator, Rabbi Shmuel Ibn Tibon, right? The Ibn Tibon family were the famous Arabic to Hebrew translators in the Middle Ages. The Sefer HaMitzvot and the Perush Mishnayos was Shmuel's father, Yehuda Ibn Tibon. The Moreh Nevuchim, Yehuda had already died, so it was Shmuel Ibn Tibon, who actually, as he was translating, he actually asked the Rambam. He would check with the Rambam what the right translations would be. And in fact, the Rambam issued a very famous letter about translations, interestingly enough, where the Rambam says a translator should not aim for a word-to-word translation, because the Rambam said languages have different syntactical arrangements. Let's take a very simple example, Hebrew. Vayomer Hashem. If I translate that literally, and said God. But in English, that's not how you talk. You don't put the verb before the noun. You don't say, and said God. You say, and God said. So you're already changing the order of words. So the Rambam wrote to Shmuel ibn Tibon that it's very, very important that you not become slavishly over literal. You have to master the content of what is said, and then you need to express it in the words of the language to which you are translating. That's an important guide to translation. Of course, translation is a surprisingly difficult art because, on one hand, you're not going to do word for word. On the other hand, you don't want to impose your commentary on it, meaning a sentence is especially in the Moreh Nevuchim, where the Rambam warns us of this. Sentences are sometimes deliberately ambiguous. They are deliberately written to convey multiple meanings. Now, you're trying to translate it, and you're saying, well, this is going to be ambiguous. I need to clarify it. But no, you're defeating the purpose here. You're using your translation to be a commentary. So, in truth, translation is a very, very difficult art because, on one hand, you want to avoid being overly literal. On the other hand, you don't want to take sides. If a sentence can have many interpretations, you want to leave as many nuances as the original had. Of course, by definition, you're going to lose something, whether it's translating the Torah or anything else. By definition, you're going to lose quite a lot, but you try to preserve as much as possible. Uh, Interestingly enough, I think I had mentioned the very famous letter of the Rambam, where the Rambam says, I work all day as a doctor and I don't eat, at the in the caliph's court, and then I come home and it's already night and there are hundreds of people waiting for me for shilas or tzedakah or refuah, and I just ask him to let me alone for a half an hour so I can eat, and then I meet people till 2 hours into the night, and then I try to learn, till midnight and after midnight, and then the next day it starts all over again. I think I mentioned that letter to you about how hard the Rambam worked. He says, only on Shabbat I have a little bit of rest, and what I do is I learn with people the whole day on Shabbat. That's what he says. So I want you to know, I don't think I mentioned this, this was actually a letter to Rav Shmuel ibn Tiban, who wanted a personal meeting with the Rambam to discuss the Moreh Nevuchim. And apparently someone said the Rambam just didn't want to meet in person. He didn't have time. So he just said, again, been there, done that. He says, don't have time. My schedule is so packed. So it may have been. So who knows? Maybe I don't know. I mean, obviously I don't know, but maybe the Rambam schedule was not exactly as totally busy as he said. But he didn't want to have a personal meeting. He said, "You just stay where you are, and we can correspond by writing," and that's going to be fine. So again, 1185 to 1190 is the composition of the Moreh Nevuchim. 1204 is the completion of the translation by Reb Shmuel ibn Tiban, and did become the standard translation for hundreds and hundreds of years. In recent decades, we've had both new Hebrew translations in more modern Hebrew. Rav Kapach, the great Yemenite rabbi, retranslated all of the Rambam's Arabic works into a more modern Hebrew. And there's a professor, Michael Schwartz, who did a new translation of the Moreh Nevuchim in Hebrew from the Arabic. And then we have new English translations. The standard English translation was Michael Friedlander, which, by the way, is available for free online. Friedlander's translation is, I believe, the late 1800s. It's a good translation. It goes all the way back. But then we have more modern things. Including some very recent, just last year, a very recent new translation. I've read an interesting critique of the new translation that it attempts to make the Moreh Nevuchim so readable that it eliminates some of the mysterious complexity, meaning some books are not meant to be oversimplified. And the accusation against the newest translation is it tries to be so clear that it eliminates some of the ambiguities. And yet the Rambam did have a shita, which sounds a little strange to us, that he said to his Talmud, I am introducing some deliberate ambiguities and contradictions in this pasuk because I'm writing it for discerning minds who will be able to put the pieces together. Again, this sounds very strange to a modern reader, because we assume, that's a normal assumption, whether, some authors are not that good at it, but we assume that the purpose of an author is to be as clear as possible in communicating a message. Now, again, some people are better at it than others. Yeah, granted. But as a goal, the goal should be, I want to be understood. And yet, the Rambam had a certain approach to certain mystical philosophical doctrines that I'm not writing this for the masses. I'm writing this for special individuals. And therefore, I'm going to be deliberately obscure. So the masses are going to be scared. I'm not going to read that. It doesn't make any sense. But those who persevere, right? So this notion of deliberate obscurity, the Rambam himself introduces in the Moreh Nevuchim. And as a result, as I say, when translations try to be overly clear, they say they're actually departing from the Rambam's view. Okay. Now, the Moreh Nevuchim itself is certainly one of the classic, maybe the greatest book of Jewish philosophy, no question about it. It also had a tremendous influence on Christian theological thought. The greatest systematic Christian theologian is generally said to be Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the Summa Theologica, kind of the logical principles of the faith. And I'm not going to say it's based on Rambam; it's based on a lot of things. But the Moreh Nevuchim was in Latin, because it has been translated in Latin too, was a major influence in Thomas Aquinas, other Duns Scotus, various other Christian theologians. It also had a great influence in Arabic thought over the years. In fact, the Moreh Nevuchim in Arabic, in its original Arabic, has never gone out of print in Arab countries. I mean, it's interesting. And even in the years when there was a state of war between all of these countries and Israel, but in the university libraries even in the high-end bookstores, the Guide to the Perplexed was always available in Arabic as a philosophical work that was very relevant to Islamic theology. So it was a very important work that had a great deal of influence. Interestingly enough, its influence within Judaism, gone up, gone down, gone up, gone down. So, for example, in most yeshivot, you will not find the Moreh Nevuchim in the regular base medrash. You'll go to the shelf, and you will certainly see the books of the Mishna Torah, every Sefer HaMitzvos. Certainly, they're going to be there. Then you ask Moreh Nevuchim, well, go to the side room here and get the key from the librarian, and we'll find you a Moreh Nevuchim. So it's interesting that just the past few years, there seems to be a resurgence of interest, new translations, English, Hebrew, and not only translations, but books like Guide to the Guide, books which are trying to summarize and clarify. So it is interesting that after many decades, if not even centuries, in which the Moreh was neglected by the mainstream Orthodox community, it seems to be coming back. In many ways as well, the rise of Kabbalah did not bode well for the Moreh Nevuchim. Right? The Moreh Nevuchim is a book of rational analytical philosophy. The world of Kabbalah is the world of mysticism and nonlinear thoughts. And even though most of us don't learn Kabbalah, but you have to know that mainstream Judaism has largely become Kabbalistic. We're all Kabbalists, whether you know it or not. And as a result, the whole rational tradition of Rav Sadia Gaon, before the Rambam, as well as the Rambam, kind of faded into the background because Kabbalah became the new theology of Judaism. So there were different reasons why the Moreh went up and the Moreh went down. But as I say, it's a book that even people who don't learn have to acknowledge its great importance, if for no other reason than the Rambam wrote it. Who are the Nevuchim? The guide to those who are confused. Now, obviously, he considered Yosef ben Yehuda to be someone who was confused. He wrote it for him, but it's much more. Say again? Yir Shushan Nevocha. Same word. That's exactly right. Shushan. Yeah. But I don't think he wrote it for Achashverosh. Achashverosh wouldn't get it. So the Rambam himself says that he's writing this book for those people who are faithful to the Torah. They want to keep the Torah. But there are things in the Torah which is called revealed truth, which don't seem to be consistent with the philosophical truths that have been arrived at by human reason. And thus, they're perturbed because although they want to be observant, they find that the observances or the mitzvot or the history or the account does not fit the inner logic of philosophy. So in many ways, Moreh Nevuchim is an attempt to create a reconciliation, a synthesis between two sources of truth that we access. One is the truth of revelation. God just tells you something. and the other is the truths of human reason. And in theory, truth ought to be unitary, meaning to say, if something is true in one sphere, it ought to be true in the other sphere. And people were confused, and therefore, and it's been pointed out that the Mishnah Torah and the Moreh Nevuchim are kind of addressing two different audiences, although they overlap a lot. The Mishnah Torah is addressing every Jew who wants to keep the mitzvot. Some Jews are philosophers, some Jews are not. Some Jews have these problems, some Jews are not. Either way, Mishnah Torah tells you what to do. Moreh Nevuchim is more limited in its scope. It's limited to Jews with certain questions. If you don't have the questions, okay, doesn't bother you. Maybe the book is not for you. But if you have the questions, this is a book that addresses them. This is the Nevuchim. Yeah.
So I think that let's say, for instance, Yaakov Avinu was called Mishna Emes, but what he did was not Emes. So I always know that there are two kinds of Emes. The Emes, the Torah is not the Emes, not the human seichel. So
Yeah.
I don't know how
Yeah. So see, but you're already, whether you know it or not, you're already speaking Kabbalah. See. No, it's an amazing thing. Things that, it's not that we're Kabbalah, but things that we learn in yeshiva, things that we learn in seminary. These are Kabbalistic ideas, actually, that have become mainstream. The Rambam belonged to an older tradition that said it's either emes or sheker. There's no two types of emes, two levels of emes, and therefore the Rambam attempts a reconciliation. Now you have to know that in the Middle Ages, philosophy meant Aristotle. Aristotle was the Yesod. Now remember how long this was. Aristotle lived approximately 400 BCE. BCE. He was in, of course, Macedonia, then Greece. The Rambam is living, right, the 12th century. So we're talking about 1,600 years after Aristotle's death. The mainstream philosophy of Christianity, in terms of philosophy, of Islam, and of Judaism, within the rationalist tradition, is Aristotelian. Now, granted, Aristotle had many meforshim, just like rabbinic literature. There were many Arabic commentators on Aristotle that the Rambam drew upon, Avicenna and Abu Rashad, different ones. So Aristotle was reinterpreted in many, many ways. But Aristotle was the Bible of philosophy in Europe. That's what it was. And therefore, when the Rambam wants to reconcile or explain contradictions between Torah and philosophy, he is dealing with Aristotelian philosophy. Now, that immediately creates a certain merchak that we'll have towards the Moreh Nevuchim, simply because Aristotelian philosophy is no longer the normative philosophy generally. So some of the issues that the Rambam had to address are not always the issues that bother people today. People today are bothered by other issues, not necessarily the issues that the Rambam was concerned with. And that creates a difficulty in the Moreh, because if you don't have a grounding in Aristotle, you're not going to fully understand what the Rambam is trying to answer. Nevertheless, the underlying insights are still very, very valuable. So next week, I'm going to continue with this a little bit. Again, I do apologize for not getting to the letters yet, but I think it is very worthwhile to at least give you an acquaintance with the books, because the books are referred to in the letters many, many, many times. So the letters presuppose that you're familiar with at least the structure of the Svarim. Have a wonderful week and Kol Tov.